On Friday, August 10th of 2018, after the markets had closed so share prices wouldn't take too big a hit, The Hollywood Reporter broke the scoop that both Chris Hemsworth and, worse yet, Captain Kirk himself, Chris Pine, had walked away from the negotiation table, putting Star Trek IV in peril. Rumor has it, they may not be the last to go. Rather than merely a bargaining tactic, this is symptomatic of the troubled production history the Kelvin Timeline Star Trek movies have endured despite their arguably strong start in 2009. In this video, we will take a brief look back at that production history, why the future of the Kelvin Timeline started to look uncertain following Star Trek Beyond. We'll also look at the planned Star Trek IV, why Chris Pine and Chris Hemsworth dropped out of it, and finally, we'll take a look at the rumored Quentin Tarantino directed Star Trek movie. After the corporate split of the old Viacom in 2005, Paramount was moved to a new corporate owner, the new Viacom, not related to the old. In the move, they retained ownership of the 10 Star Trek movies made up until then, but they lost the right to make any new ones, as the ultimate ownership of the Star Trek brand, which includes the right to make any new installments, remained with the original corporate owner, now renamed the CBS Corporation. At this time, back in 2005, the one franchise Paramount had going for them was Mission Impossible. Keep in mind, both Transformers and distributing Iron Man from Marvel were years into the future still. Paramount were quite pleased with how the then-in-development third movie in the Mission Impossible franchise was shaping up, but they were a lot less happy with star Tom Cruise himself, who at the time spent a lot of energy promoting Scientology, much to the detriment of not only his public persona, but every movie he headlined. Following the release of Mission Impossible 3, Tom Cruise would even be fired from all Paramount Productions by Viacom CEO Sumner Redstone, a move which ended the Mission Impossible franchise for the rest of the decade. But Tom Cruise's public buffoonery aside, Paramount were exceedingly happy with how the movie Mission Impossible 3 turned out, and blamed any perceived underperformance squarely on Tom Cruise. The movie's director J.J. Abrams, his production company Bad Robot, and Bad Robot's staff writers Alex Kurtzman and Robert Orci all became instant golden boys at Paramount. As such, when Paramount decided they wanted to take another crack at making a Star Trek franchise, but reimagine it as a fast-paced, big-budget sci-fi fantasy crowd-pleaser in the vein of Star Wars, J.J. Abrams and his Bad Robot crew were their go-to guys. Abrams was reluctant at first. He was a Star Wars fan at heart and took some convincing, but rumor has it the production deal, which would make all things Star Trek very lucrative for Bad Robot, sealed the deal. As we've covered in earlier videos, Paramount were able to overcome the problem of no longer having the right to produce new Star Trek movies by negotiating a deal with CBS, a deal which ended with an alternate Star Trek copyright being issued to Paramount. This licensing agreement allowed Paramount and production company Bad Robot to not only make new Star Trek movies, but also to keep all revenue from any merchandise based on their Star Trek. There were, however, two caveats. One was that unless a new installment was made in a given number of years after the previous, the rights would be forfeit. The other was that any Star Trek made under this alternate copyright had to visually and tonally differ from the original Star Trek, which was still owned by CBS. This way the streams would not cross. Paramount would get the revenue from Paramount Star Trek and merchandise based on it, while CBS would cash in on the annual retainer fee Paramount had to pay for the license, plus they got to keep all the revenue generated from merchandise based on their original Star Trek. CBS also had to agree not to release any new Star Trek on TV for 10 years, while Paramount built their Star Trek brand on film, which was easy for CBS to accept. CBS head honcho Les Moonves had just canceled Enterprise and had no plans to pursue any more Star Trek anyway, so licensing it to Paramount was the only way outside of merchandise the brand would earn CBS any money. While Paramount and Bad Robot now legally can make more Star Trek movies, the agreement required to make it happen put the Star Trek brand in a new position, one that had never happened before in its then 40-year history, being managed by not one, but two different corporations, whose respective goals did not align. After a strong start, this would cause major problems later on. On May 8th of 2009, Paramount and Bad Robot Star Trek with the tagline "The Future Begins" was released. It starred Chris Pine and Zachary Quinto as the recast Kirk and Spock, as well as Leonard Nimoy reprising his signature role as the original Spock for the first time since 1991. It also featured a pre-Thor fame Chris Hemsworth in a smaller role as Kirk's father. Instead of wiping the slate clean as is customary with reboots, the movie was something of an in-continuity reboot, where events from the post-Nemesis era of the Prime universe created a parallel universe and a new timeline dubbed the Kelvin Timeline. This was where Paramount's movies would be set, while CBS, in principle, could revisit the Prime timeline in the future and have future TV series play out there, if they so chose. After a very successful marketing campaign, the Star Trek reboot opened to $79 million and went on to gross $385 million worldwide on a budget of $150 million, the up to then highest in Star Trek history. In addition to being the greatest financial success in Star Trek film history, the movie was also a hit with critics and moviegoers alike, despite a lot of older fans having issues with it. Even so, the brand was seemingly revitalized in a big way. All they had to do now was make an equally appealing follow-up and fast while the movie was still in the public consciousness, and they still had the momentum. Realizing this, Paramount requested that Bad Robot have a sequel ready for release as early as 2011. They didn't. While writers Orci, Kurtzman, and Lindelof set to work fairly quickly, it would appear that between writers and producers, they struggled to lock anything down, and J.J. Abrams being busy making Super 8 didn't help matters either. A year and a half later, in December of 2010, Abrams told CinemaBlend that there was still no script, and a month after that, in January of 2011, he followed up that he still didn't know if he would direct or not, as he hadn't seen a script. But then, in the first quarter of 2011, things started happening. Paramount started financing pre-production in the spring of 2011. Orci told WonderCon audiences that the script had been completed in April of 2011, and in May of 2011, Abrams told MTV that he would turn his attention to Star Trek once Super 8 was finished. In the end, Star Trek Into Darkness was released in 2013, a full 4 years after the highly successful reboot. On several occasions, Abrams stated that he would rather have the movie be good instead of hitting a certain release date. There is indeed something to be said for that, but in the 4 years between the two movies, a lot of the momentum garnered by the 2009 movie had evaporated. Star Trek Into Darkness received generally positive reviews from critics and wider audiences alike. Star Trek fans, however, were not impressed. Even more so considering that for Trek fans, who clearly saw through the reveal of Benedict Cumberbatch as Khan and not John Harrison, the film would go on to become not only disliked, but reviled. Abrams would later express disappointment over Star Trek Into Darkness and regret over the creative choices made in it, such as lying to the fans about Khan. Financially, Into Darkness cost about $40 million more to make than its predecessor and grossed about $30 million less in the US, while Into Darkness grossed $100 million more internationally than the 2009 movie. This was offset by the decline in home media sales, meaning Into Darkness was ultimately far less profitable for its producers than the 2009 movie. The movie didn't cause Paramount any losses, but it didn't reach profitability until it was released in secondary markets. While not a flop, Into Darkness was an underperformer, and the pressure was on the third movie to deliver, and it would have to do so without J.J. Abrams at the helm, as frustration drove him to jump ship to Star Wars. Star Wars would eventually face problems of its own, but that's a story for another video. J.J. Abrams' initial vision for Star Trek wasn't just making a new movie every few years, but to turn Bad Robot and Paramount's alternate Star Trek license into a multi-platform experience that spanned television and digital entertainment as well as comic books. But as we mentioned earlier, a term of the licensing agreement with CBS was that Paramount could only release and benefit from merchandise in the likeness of its own Star Trek, while CBS reaped all revenue from merchandise based on the likeness of the original Prime Star Trek. As it in time would turn out, merchandise based on the original Prime Star Trek outsold merchandise based on Bad Robot and Paramount's alternate Kelvin Star Trek by an astounding margin. Furthermore, market research revealed that the availability of merchandise based on both the original Prime Star Trek as well as the alternate Kelvin Star Trek caused brand confusion. Paramount approached CBS on Bad Robot's behalf and requested that they pull the plug on any and all merchandise based on the original series, so that Kelvin Star Trek would be the only Star Trek in film, in video games, on toy shelves, and in comic book stores. CBS told them, in not so many words, to get bent. Star Trek Prime merchandise netted CBS about $20 million a year, and they weren't about to shut down that revenue stream just so Paramount, technically a corporate rival, could increase their own earnings at CBS's expense, using a CBS-owned brand no less. As a result, Bad Robot and Paramount had to scale back their transmedia franchise plans for Star Trek into just movies, and individual licensing agreements surrounding them. According to a scoop published by The Wrap, it was frustration over this very situation that caused J.J. Abrams to jump ship and take on Star Wars instead. On Star Wars, there was only one corporate owner to deal with, and therefore no licensing situation and no competing corporate goals. On Star Wars, he could make the transmedia franchise he had wanted for Star Trek before rights issues thwarted it all. While Abrams would continue to produce, the next Star Trek movie would have to make do with another director. Paramount realized a big part of Into Darkness's underperformance was down to momentum being lost from the long production period. For the next movie, they were adamant that it couldn't take as long to produce as Into Darkness, and insisted on a 2016 release to coincide with Star Trek's 50th anniversary. J.J. Abrams had jumped ship and was busy directing Star Wars The Force Awakens, so it was clear from day one the movie needed another director. On the writing side, Kurtzman had left to write for Sony's Spider-Man Cinematic Universe, which would ultimately be aborted one movie in, while Robert Orci, the one bona fide Star Trek fan in Bad Robot, stayed on writing Star Trek 3. He would soon be joined by J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay. Orci would also lobby to direct the movie, and after talks with Rupert Wyatt and Joe Cornish didn't lead to anything further, Paramount reportedly offered him the director's chair in May of 2014. Robert Orci, producer, writer, and now director, handed in the first draft of the script in August of 2014. It would appear that this script was well received. In September, rumors began to circulate that the Robert Orci-directed Star Trek 3 would feature William Shatner. Shatner would reprise the role of the older Captain Kirk, either Prime through hologram or future Kelvin through time travel. In October, news articles suggested the cast was gearing up for production and would film in a matter of months, partially in South Korea. Appearances, though, can be deceiving, as none of this was ever going to happen. In actual reality, Paramount hated Robert Orci's script from the moment it was handed to them. So much so that they not only scrapped it in its entirety, but fired Robert Orci over it. According to insiders with knowledge of the situation, security even marched Orci out of the Paramount lot, although it would take a long time before word of it got out. But it eventually did. On December 5th, The Hollywood Reporter broke the scoop that there was indeed something to the rumors that had been circling internally in Hollywood for months. Orci was no longer directing Star Trek 3. He would receive a marquee producer credit only, but his involvement with Star Trek was over. It would later emerge that the script by Orci, J.D. Payne, and Patrick McKay had been thrown out in its entirety as well. Scotty actor Simon Pegg would later comment on the situation, and said that the rejected script was a little bit too Star Trek-y. The Avengers, which is a pretty nerdy comic book supposedly niche thing, made $1.5 billion. Star Trek Into Darkness made $500 million, which is still brilliant, but it means that according to the studio, there's still $1 billion worth of box office that don't go and see Star Trek, and they want to know why. As of the beginning of December 2014, it was clear that despite recent reports to the contrary, Star Trek 3 officially had no director and no script, but still a release date was looming on the horizon, just 1.5 years away. But while the genre media were releasing stories that were fed to them about Shatner's return and filming in South Korea, Bad Robot and Paramount of course knew the real situation and already had alternate plans set in motion. On December 22, 2014, just 2 weeks after word got out of Orci's firing, it was announced that Justin Lin of Fast and Furious fame had stepped in to direct Star Trek Beyond. While not a hardcore fan, Lin had grown up with Star Trek and considered it a part of him. So despite an extremely tight schedule, he accepted the challenge. His take was to deconstruct a franchise for its 50th anniversary and to rebuild it in a way that would reaffirm why we loved it for half a century. The new script for Justin Lin's Star Trek Beyond was written somewhat surprisingly by Scotty actors Simon Pegg and Doug Young, who wrote it together in between watching episodes of the original series. The movie was filmed between June and October of 2015, with reshoots adding a new character taking place in March of 2016. The movie was completed and released on time on July 22nd of 2016. Star Trek Beyond was well received by critics and on the whole very well received by fans. Even quite a few old-time fans who had rejected the earlier Kelvin Timeline movies reported liking this one, as it was much more in keeping with the original series. However, between the competitive release date being released after the disappointing Into Darkness and fans being angry over the concurrent Axanar lawsuit and the tragic premature death of Chekhov actor Anton Yelchin, the audience didn't show up. Star Trek Beyond opened to just $59 million in its domestic opening weekend, $10.6 million lower than Star Trek Into Darkness. Take away the 3D and IMAX price bumps and adjust for inflation, and the franchise was, attendance-wise, back to where it had been in the 80s and 90s. But back then, Star Trek movies were a whole lot cheaper to make. Star Trek Beyond was by contrast the most expensive Star Trek movie ever made, bar none. First developing one incarnation of a movie, only to scrap it, then developing another, and bring that to the screen in just a year and a half is a very expensive undertaking under the best of circumstances. Especially so for an extremely effects-heavy movie like Star Trek Beyond. Paramount will admit to an initial budget in the $185 million range. But after reshoots and the very expensive promotional and release campaign, the movie is rumored to have a final price tag in the vicinity of $390 million. Worldwide, it grossed only $336 million. How much of that gross the studio gets to keep varies from territory to territory around the world. On average, it adds up to about half, which means that even after home media sales and TV licensing deals are accounted for, Star Trek Beyond would end up in the range of $100 million in the red. Despite the approval of those who did see it, Star Trek Beyond was a franchise-ending financial bomb. But for Paramount, the problems run deeper than just one franchise. Paramount didn't just lose big on Star Trek Beyond. Both Monster Trucks and the Ben-Hur remake blew up in their faces, and the most recent Transformers movie underperformed in a big way too. The problem with such a string of flops is that the market value of the studio flounders, and the access to new investment capital dries up as investors lose confidence. This is indeed what has happened. Like several other of their movies from this time, Star Trek Beyond was in no small part funded by Chinese money through several different Chinese investment companies. Between the losses they incurred on various Paramount movies, as well as changes in Chinese financial legislation, Paramount's access to fresh Chinese capital has been closed, and they have to look elsewhere for further funding. The fact of the matter is that Paramount is more than $10 billion in debt, some claim closer to $15 billion. In any event, they have made significant staff cuts, are on the verge of bankruptcy, and are dragging down parent company Viacom with them, which is why a remerger with CBS is being discussed. Though at the time of making this video, this is not yet formally decided. We will cover this more in detail in a separate video. But against this backdrop, and with Star Trek Beyond incurring Paramount and their investors a loss in the $100 million range, why would they even consider Star Trek 4? On July 18th of 2016, just days before the release of Star Trek Beyond, Paramount, Skydance, and Bad Robot formally announced Star Trek 4. This time, the story was ready in advance, written by J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay, the co-writers of the rejected Star Trek 3. The press release stated that, in the next installment of the epic space adventure, Chris Pine's Captain Kirk will cross paths with a man he never had a chance to meet, but whose legacy has haunted him since the day he was born, his father. Furthermore, the press release also confirmed that Chris Hemsworth, Chris Pine, and Zachary Quinto were on board for a fourth film, and that the remaining cast also were expected to return, although no new contracts had been signed with them. The initial contracts for the Kelvin Timeline cast were only for 3 movies, so for the fourth one, new contracts had to be signed with everyone. Pine, Hemsworth, and Quinto were promised huge pay raises and bonuses for signing on, so they did. The remaining cast were soon to fall in line later on. Getting 3 leads to commit was the priority, as they wanted to announce the movie with Hemsworth, now of Marvel's Thor fame, before the release of Star Trek Beyond. The reason for doing so was that this announcement was meant more for potential investors than it was for fans. While Star Trek Beyond had not been released at this time, tracking numbers were in, so they knew Star Trek Beyond would underperform. The Star Trek 4 announcement was all about selling investors on an offering they should not want to miss out on. Even if Beyond might not work out, the next one has Thor, was the implied sales pitch. The ones behind it were allegedly Bad Robot. While the Kelvin Timeline movies hadn't worked out so well for Paramount or their investors, they had worked out exceedingly well for Bad Robot, even Star Trek Beyond. The money paid for making those movies were paid to Bad Robot, who not only retained a certain percentage in production fees, but they could do a lot of the work in-house. Meaning, money effectively only moved from internal expenses accounts to internal income accounts. For them, being in the Star Trek business was very lucrative, even if the finished movies were not for the ultimate bill payers. They still needed those ultimate bill payers to pony up for the movies though. After Star Trek Beyond flopped as badly as it did, and with Paramount's sources of funding dried up, Star Trek 4 was dead, adrift in space for the next 2 years. In February of 2018, at the quarterly conference call, Viacom Chief Financial Officer Wade Davis addressed the new strategy which was aimed at turning Paramount Pictures around under a new management. He told stakeholders that to achieve a turnaround, Paramount needs to release films at a more regular pace and have those films be successful. while working to mitigate risk and spending marketing money more efficiently. Moving forward, he continued, Paramount plans to lean on co-produced films with a number of partners, focusing on fast production cycles and budgets that are economically attractive. This is another way of saying more movies with audience appeal on smaller budgets. This strategy may give Star Trek on film a new lease on life. Each subsequent Kelvin Timeline Star Trek movie had cost more and grossed less than the previous one, so as big-budget tentpole blockbusters, Star Trek failed. But there is a significant fanbase out there, so if the production cost can be capped at a level where the movie only has to perform like Star Trek Beyond did to be profitable, making more Star Trek movies may still be a viable option. But even with the significantly reduced price tag, Paramount doesn't have the resources necessary to fund any more Star Trek movies by themselves, meaning they need to attract production partners and investors to do so. And after Paramount's recent history, investors do indeed need to be attracted with offers they can't refuse. To this end, Star Trek IV, the one guest starring Marvel's Thor, was brought back. On April 26 of 2018, Variety broke the scoop that director S.J. Clarkson, who had previously worked on the series The Defenders, Jessica Jones, Orange is the New Black, and the UK version of the series Life on Mars, was tapped to direct Star Trek IV, making her the first female director to take on a Star Trek feature film. You could be forgiven for thinking that a director being appointed means funding is secured, but this is not the case. On the contrary, the appointment of the first female director in the franchise's cinematic history is a strategic one, intended to add another selling point for potential investors. The biggest selling point for investors, though, is to reduce the risk, which means reducing the movie's production budget. In order to do so, the cast salaries, which were scaled for high-end big-budget blockbusters in earlier agreements, have to be reduced. We do not know how much Chris Pine and Chris Hemsworth were promised for their participation in Star Trek IV, but we do know that Pine was paid $6 million for Star Trek Beyond, and that Chris Hemsworth is Thor, so both were likely to be promised more than that. Likewise, the cast will also have been promised significant pay raises to sign on for a fourth movie. What this adds up to is that Star Trek IV, if it were to honor the earlier agreements, would cost several tens of million dollars in cast salaries alone, before even a penny would have been spent on actually filming anything. Even if they scaled back on special effects, the final cost would have been in the same range as the earlier Kelvin Timeline movies, and they won't attract any investors that way. To this end, Paramount tried to bargain with the cast about reducing their salaries in order to bring the total cost down. Chris Hemsworth and Chris Pine would have none of it, leaving both sides to walk away from the negotiating table, according to The Hollywood Reporter. It is not outside the realm of possibility that both parties could resume talks and meet each other halfway. In either event, insiders with knowledge of the situation told The Hollywood Reporter that Star Trek IV is moving on full steam ahead even without Pine and Hemsworth. That is posturing. As we've covered, the reason Paramount have to scale the budget back is because they don't have the money to make the movie, and they can't attract investors to fund it, not at the price tag the movie would come in at if the original deals were to be honored. Losing Hemsworth is losing the selling point which made them announce Star Trek IV before Star Trek Beyond opened to begin with. And losing Pine merely isn't losing a selling point, but a staple any investor would take for granted would be there in a Star Trek movie. Unless the different parties can work out a deal, the future is looking grim for Star Trek IV as it is currently packaged. But there is also another Star Trek movie in development. On December 4th of 2017, Deadline Hollywood broke the scoop that Quentin Tarantino wanted to write and direct an R-rated Star Trek movie, which by all outwardly appearances appeared to be rushed through production. As we've established before though, appearances can be deceiving. According to Simon Pegg, Tarantino's Star Trek won't be made for another 5 to 6 years, by which time he wonders if the current cast may be too old to star in it anyway. Pegg isn't the only one talking about the day the current cast won't be there anymore. Even Spock actor Zachary Quinto has stated that if Star Trek IV gets made, and if the Tarantino movie follows it, that will likely be his last time playing Spock. As of the making of this video, August 17th of 2018, Chris Pine has already dropped out, and we are hearing rumors emanating from the production that the remaining cast are out the door as well. Between Paramount's precarious financial situation and their need for external funding, and the wavering commitment of some of the cast members, the future of the Kelvin Timeline movies looks uncertain. Do you think Star Trek 4 will be made? And if it isn't, how will you look back on the Kelvin Timeline Star Trek movies? Let us know in the comments. Then, please help share the video and subscribe to Midnight's Edge and hit the bell, as we have much more Star Trek coverage lined up, both about the right situation, Axanar, and other related matters. For complete coverage on all things Star Trek, also check out our sister channel Midnight's Edge After Dark, as well as Overlord DVD, where revelations made in Midnight's Edge videos will be further dissected and discussed in live shows. Also, if you like what we do, then please consider supporting us on Patreon, as Paramount does have a tendency to demonetize our videos.